this is going to be my 30th year of teaching. It was the most impactful Remembrance Day ceremony I have ever witnessed. For the very first time, the story of contributions to people in Canada and a sense of belonging. It created a sense of belonging for a diverse number of students and their families. And it gave us the opportunity to make space, a whole space, so that students and their families can tell those untold stories. So typically, leadership of schools can tell some stories, and certainly we can tell our own stories. The authentication in those stories come out of the voice of the families who experienced the stories. It's their stories. So that's why I felt it was impactful. It was authentic, it was meaningful, it was deep, and the children listened to each other. And that for me was very moving. We're saying typically, meaning stereotypically, because we're not saying it's absolute that every single school used to have the poem in Flanders Field and the last poet, whether it be done live or recording as musical Black. We're not saying that, but we're saying for the most parts, that's what it was. And that's what it still is. You would see red poppies as the symbol, the physical symbol. You would hear about one soldier and you will hear the music. Sometimes bagpipes are added. And the veteran and representation of the veterans typically does not reflect the representation of Canada from its inception. So when you look at it now, we know that Canada was built on Indigenous land. Therefore, there were Indigenous people here, and Indigenous soldiers went and fought for Canada. They were not treated the way that they should have been treated, probably, but Indigenous soldiers played an important part in our wars. And that's one of the untold stories, right? Black soldiers. There have been Black soldiers. The number 2 battalion in Nova Scotia in the Second World War was the first time that Black soldiers actually came together as a group to go and fight for Canada in Europe. And they were not treated well. So we have the untold story of Indigenous soldiers and Black soldiers being at the front line because their lives were not valued as the white soldiers. So having said that, and we know that immigration to Canada is rich. We have a rich Jewish population and Jewish population here in Canada. We know that the CN Railroad was built on the backs of Chinese immigrants. So we know the fabric, how the mosaic of Canada. So therefore, we can infer that the soldiers who went to fight represented those bodies. For adults, we call it professional development because professional development is all about adults and the adults learning. So first we have to unlearn, undo, deconstruct what we know to be comfortable, because what is comfortable is not always what is right or what is needed for our young people. So in terms of our staff development, we work with foundations of equity and inclusion. That's what we work with. So that is not just for Remembrance Day, it's right across the board. Anything that we do, we first stop, reflect, have professional development delivered so that we can interrogate our biases and actually listen and look to see if we're and how we can better deliver our practice. Now, in terms of the young people in front of us, our students, our jobs, well, the way I see it in terms of leadership, our jobs is to create spaces to become better listeners because they are full of stories. We're not taking away anything. And I think the fear comes when folks feel like they're being erased to put something else in its place. And we basically to get a visual, we're turning squares into circles. We are pushing out the corners so that we can literally be more inclusive. So it's written in a certain way. We honor and observe Canada. The Canadian flag will be there. And the soldiers that we know and love will be there. We will be telling stories of soldiers that we've not heard from before. We'll be telling stories that some families and communities have had hidden away in their heart without resolve, without healing, without honoring, without recognition. Those are the stories that we are making space for. And let's start with the Indigenous stories. Let's start with the African Canadian stories back in 1608 to now, 2023. Black people have immigrated to Canada for as long as that time span. So let's keep our stories authentic. And as a school leader, as I mentioned before, my job is to create space for all stories. We know that presently there's still a war in the Ukraine. We have Ukraine students in our classrooms right now. We have to be sensitive. We have to be trauma informed while we actually celebrate life and hold what we know in our souls to be a solemn time. Because certainly we're not told to celebrate wars. So yeah, I do believe that in my leadership capacity, that there's room to change and include all stories.